All right. We're at part 4 of the Data Sources 1 workshop. This is a brief segment about restricted data. Restricted data has become more and more important in the research context. Some of the unanswered questions or more interesting questions evolve from wanting to know as much about people as possible and to be able to follow individuals over time in the details of the things that influence them or the decisions that they make or their ultimate outcomes where they end up in life. So in order to do that, detailed questions need to be asked. Information that leads to the data set itself having personally identifiable information, and often sensitive information about vulnerable populations. So when you're talking about early childhood influences, data about minors that then influences their education and employment, data about crime or illegal drug use, or also populations who have less ability to consent to study, such as incarcerated or mentally ill people. These are all cases where there has to be care taken to protect the subjects of research, also to make sure that people are willing to participate in research that has social value but could be damaging if it was released. So, and one thing that often leads to easily identifiable information is location information or just too much specificity about someone's age or personal characteristics or things like that. So while a publicly available data set might mask some of these details, group people into larger categories, tell you that, oh, we can't get down below the state level for what we're reporting. Restricted data might have all of that information, but you must demonstrate that you're going to handle the data responsibly. You're going to keep it private. You're not going to. This data is kept off of the internet, kept off of a download click for a reason, and they want to make sure that you're not going to undo that by or by simply being sloppy of where you put the data, have someone else grab the data. You're going to be responsible in the way that you report and describe and use the data. And so ICPSR has a number of their data sets that are restricted, and they have probably one of the better described processes for applying for, accessing, publishing, researching and publishing on restricted data. So you can consult their information, and they will talk you through this whole process. There is always going to be an application process. Some of the simplest forms of restricted data for less sensitive needs are where there's simply a kind of a click-through agreement or a requirement to register and identify yourself and agree that you're not going to misuse the data before you download it. At least there is a record of who has been using the data. Then, depending on the sensitivity of the data, there is more and more protection. As you can see here, there might be a data enclave, either virtual or physical, that you couldn't move the data off of it. The data never sort of can be copied out into the wild, and depending on the data set, the application requirements may differ, but they typically involve a plan on why do you need this data, what special use are you getting out of it, what's the benefit, how are you going to protect the data physically and sort of in a conceptual sense. And you'll also have to run all that through your institutional review board typically, because the data is sensitive unless there is an exemption for very standardized well-used data. So that's all described. It's something to think about. The other thing to consider with restricted data is that those processes take time. 2 weeks before the end of the semester is not the time to say, oh, I think I'll use a restricted data set for my my term project. It's something you want to build in, and often these require faculty approval for student research. Those are all things you want to consider. And I want to close with the example of the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers, right? Because this is a good example of how newer, more these have sprung up in greater numbers in relatively recent years to handle this increased research interest in the detailed data. And what happens in a Federal Statistical Research Data Center that's even beyond just a single researcher using restricted data is that in these centers you can link together government databases. So, for example, we mentioned back at the beginning, IRS. Everyone files taxes. IRS has all those records. Wouldn't it be interesting to study individuals over time, how individual income changes over time, and link that to other sources of information like census replies or other records? These linkages can be made in the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers, but they're not just going to let anybody get into the IRS data. At least that used to be the case, right? Now we have Doge interns. Who knows what they're up to? But the principle is that IRS data should be held in confidence. We hope that it will continue to be held in confidence. And if a researcher wants to use it, they should use it through a controlled process. So the FSRDCs, you have to go there, you have to use data on site. You can request things be provided to you, but they're going to be provided to you with personally identifying information removed, and the staff there will help you make these linkages, perform your research task, and then they will screen the output that you generate to make sure that you're not extracting any personal information in what you take out, right? You don't use it to say, show me the 100 richest people in the country who had the highest income and where they live, right? This is not a legitimate research request. So therefore the process is somewhat extensive, right? You have to also prove that your research really requires this kind of detailed data to make a significant advance. You have to show that the research will have some kind of benefit to the census system itself. That's a sort of distinctive requirement of these applications, that it has to kind of align with the mission of why this data is being collected in the first place, and you go through several steps of approval for this process, and then you have to actually carry out the research on site in the centers themselves. And so those are spread around the country. Our closest one to New Jersey is, well, depending on where you live, it would be either Baruch College in New York or the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And this represents kind of the most extreme dimension of restricted data. Special facilities with special applications, special screening, special staffing, but that have produced powerful insights in research because they're tapping into data that's more detailed than was possible before these centers started to arise. Okay, so that is my discussion of restricted data, and we will move on to section 5, a special focus on data for minoritized and underrepresented groups.